Hello, everybody. This is Constance with Mysterious Galaxy. I am very excited. Tonight we have Gregory Benford and Larry Niven here for you, and they are here for their book, Glorious. Now, I am going to disappear off of the screen. They have a PowerPoint set up for you guys, so I'm going to get that set up so all you guys can see the PowerPoint. And
okay. So the only good-looking person leaves the screen. Oh, who's that?
Is that you, Constance, with makeup?
Oh, Constance Sumer, yes.
Oh, yes, that was me with makeup. If it was yes, it's a big difference between what you see in reality versus when there's makeup.
Right, I'm not that fond of reality anymore. So here's Big Smart Objects. Describes the agenda of the Bowl of Heaven series of 3 novels because they're all about colossal structures built by aliens. And Larry and I set out to do this precisely because it was Larry's forte, after all. You do the next slide. Next slide is Larry's ring world, which he invented in the 1960s when the Earth was new. And I assume most people have probably read this, including all the dynamics that emerged later. Next slide. Because Dyson spheres are really big.
Yes. Dyson spheres are unwieldy.
Right. Requires more than just another government grant.
Depends on the government who you're dealing with. There may be governments out there that can handle the job.
Yes. You know, Larry, I don't think I ever asked you, where did the idea come from?
From Poole Anderson's version of Dyson Sphere, which he was talking about it, and it came out something like a golf ball, 93 million miles in radius, with a sun at the center.
Oh, next slide. Yeah.
I took just the equator and worked with that.
Right. Yeah, I remember the earlier ideas looked like something like this too. I mean, this is how you would build it. First, you build the struts, right?
Yeah, I learned all that later. I just worked straight from the golf ball and saw that I could use the equator.
How you would build it. First, you build the struts, right? Right. Good. Okay, next slide. Right. This is called a Dyson Bubble, by the way. These are all in orbit. It's not a rigid structure. You can't build a rigid structure and make it stable, by the way, because they're all trying to orbit at different speeds. So it tears itself apart, unless, of course, you have powerful struts.
That takes some very, very finicky work. You'd want a very powerful government determining where the orbits went.
Yeah, it's designed for bureaucratic overload. Yeah. Next slide. You'll see here what it would be like to try to put a Dyson sphere together. And if this looks hard, it is. So we decided to do something else, or at least Larry and I, when we were sitting around and having a drink of something or other, and we thought how to do it differently. Next slide. Sphere search. Oh, yes. I should point out that there's actually an ongoing observing pattern at Lick Observatory, property of the University of California, where I'm a professor, to look for Dyson spheres in the infrared spectrum. So far, nothing, but still, it's an ongoing program that hitchhikes on top of other observing programs. So the hunt goes on.
That was Dyson's whole point, and it's a brilliant idea. If a civilization is going to be successful, you'll find it's been expanding and building and growing its population until it needs all of the radiation from a star. A Dyson Sphere, however you build it, uses all of that radiation, radiates it at a much lower temperature.
Right.
You look for the much lower temperature coming from what doesn't quite look like a star.
Exactly. Next slide. Here's the foundational document. Peter Nichols said this decades ago, an Australian literary critic, and I'll just let the readers read it. But you see, he thought all these objects were dumb. He didn't realize that they actually needed management. Even the ring world needs management because it's unstable.
Yes.
Larry, when did you realize it was unstable?
When I think early on, but it was confirmed by a class at Caltech who were sitting in the hallway at a World Con in New York, chanting, "The ring world is unstable, the ring world is unstable." It's stable along the axis, which means if you move it along the axis, it'll settle back. But unstable in the plane.
Yes.
The attitude jets was something.
Right.
I put attitude jets into the next book.
Right. By the way, I took this and put it on the doctoral qualifying exam at UC Irvine in the mid-1970s to see how many students could find out whether it was stable or not. And luckily, almost all of them got it right. You can see easily that it's unstable because if you slide it to the side, because gravitational attraction goes down as the square distance, then the segment that's closer to the star is accelerated more than the one further away. So the whole thing just slides over and falls into the star in about a quarter of a year. So then Larry came along and fixed it in the next book, right?
Sure. Along with some other problems also spotted by people communicating with me. There was a floor of the class decided that the problem with the ring world was all the topsoil wound up in the bottoms of the oceans. So
yes.
I set in a system of pumps to pump sludge over the edge of the rim wall.
Yeah. So next slide. The point is that Larry's ideas led in the decade following to like the ONeil cylinder colony, which is a beginner project to orbit the Earth, and people live inside this big rotating cylinder, which of course hasn't been built. But it was a beginning. And I asked Jerry ONeil, what was the inspiration? And he said, well, Larry Niven's book. So we can blame you. Next slide. And then came Rendezvous with Rama by Arthur C. Clarke. And this is looking down yet another cylinder that enters the solar system, zooms through on a cruising orbit, and goes away. And it's quite a good book. I recommend it. It doesn't solve any of the problems about why the hell was this thing here or anything else, which is probably for the best. Next slide. So then we came along, Larry and I, and it opens with a starship looking like this. This is a kind of imaginative ideal of an interstellar craft that is on its way to a star called Glory, because it looks as though it has a habitable planet in it, but we don't know much more about it except for their biological signatures, and it's about 40 light years away. So this ship is cruising along, and then suddenly to the side appears something they didn't anticipate because they couldn't see it before. Next slide. And this is it. This is the bowl of heaven. And that's a star, which the bowl of heaven is using as an engine to propel itself along between stars. And it's an entire rotating habitat. What was your name for it, Larry? Was it Cup World? Is that what you said?
Cup World was part of a series of ring world takeoffs on the back of a fanzine called ONeil.
Oh.
Cup World was written up as a takeoff. You got a teacup, 93 million miles in diameter, with spaceports on the handle, and
yeah.
and mockeries of woo and his motley crew.
Yeah, so we just decided to make it a bowl. And weirdly enough, Bowl of Heaven is from the Hindic tradition. The night sky was called the Bowl of Heaven in Hindi. And there's also a book on astrology, a century old, called that. And only a year or two after our novel came out, the first one, Bowl of Heaven, a chain of basically vegetarian drinks and so on stores opened, including one right beside the UCI campus where I live. And Bowl of Heaven, it said. I was rather shocked. Who knew, right? Well, it's closed now. I don't know if the chain exists.
At coffee shops.
Yeah, who knew? So the point is, what the hell is this, the crew says. And by the way, we're having trouble. It turns out we're not doing as well, and we're running out of fuel. The fuel is drawn in. It's a ram scoop from surrounding materials, interstellar gas. And so this maybe is a good opportunity to investigate this thing, land on it, and renew our resources. So they have two motives, plus the fact that this Bowl of Heaven has many millions of times the surface area of a planet. So if you want to go to another biosphere, and this is obviously a biosphere, this is like a giant interstellar apartment building. And all that blue that you see, that's the ocean. It has an ocean, and those little sprinklings of white are clouds that wraps all the way around the bowl. So exactly, right. That's the next shot. So they come closer and they see this stuff. All those mirrors down there toward the center, where the jet goes through the knothole, those reflect the sunlight back onto the star, which is what makes the jet. So you see, it's a really big contrivance. This art, by the way, is by Don Davis, an artist friend of ours who lives up in the high desert, an astronomical artist. And he built this to our specs. You'll notice there's a helical form in the jet. Well, that's because it's confined by a helical magnetic field. You see, one of my major fields that I did research in at UC Irvine is plasma physics, and I studied the stability of exactly this kind of thing, astrophysical jets. So, you know.
That Greg was entirely in charge of.
What did you say?
That was one aspect that you, Greg, were entirely in charge of.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I did all the plasma physics and the magnetohydrodynamics, of course, that I taught. So this is where you get, the smart thing for a writer is to use what you know, or just what you think you know. Okay, next. So as they approach the Bowl of Heaven, they realize that it's spinning. It has centrifugal gravity. Here you can see the gravity at various points along the bowl. So it's a really interesting place because the gravity is not always perpendicular to the ground, and it varies. And so you can have different habitats and different kinds of animals that live in them. This is, in fact, signed by Don Davis. So the point is, we did all the calculations and all this work up before we wrote a single word, like a good graduate student, right? You write your thesis at the end. Next. And here's what it is up close. See all those clouds? Notice how curved they are? That's because they're perpetual hurricanes, which is not bad news because right next to the ocean is this field of solar panels, which are harvesting sunlight to run the whole contraption.
Yeah.
So this is what it looks like as they cruise in on it. This will give you some kind of scale. Those hurricanes in there are larger than the Earth. Just so you know. Next. So how are you going to get in? Well, it looks like the thing is heavily defended. Larry pointed this out. He said, what did you say? He said, they have gamma ray lasers on the perimeter, which is not a good sign. So you don't want to go in the top of the bowl. So we came in through the knothole, and this is how we did it, or the ship did it.
Mind you, the ship is picking up fuel as it goes, so it's got under full control of its velocity.
Yeah, I mean, so this you're slipping in the back door of the whole vast construction, which it turns out the occupants had not realized anybody would be crazy enough to try, but of course they hadn't met we smart apes. Okay, so that's going through the knothole, getting into the middle of the bowl. And you can see bits of the bowl off to the side as you go through. It's a little hard to see through the jet. This is the big driving principle of the bowl. Next. And so when you get in, it looks like this. There are clouds, there's the ocean. You're still very, very far from the floor of the bowl, and you can see reflecting mirrors down there on the lower left that are white. And so this is what the landscape looks like. But of course, it's actually a giant construction. And you can see the knothole way up in the upper left, too, with all those reflecting panels and so forth. It's a big, big public works project.
Again, all of this work has been Don Davis.
Yes. We talked it all up to Don Davis a lot, and he did all this. And he's really good. I mean, I've never known anybody who could do this kind of imaginary painting. Most astronomical paintings about stars and planets and all that old stuff. But this is new. Next. And on the surface, closer down, this is what it looks like. These are a thing called zigzag trees. And over there in the lower right, there is what looks like a fish. But actually, it is alive, but it's a giant inflated balloon that is about the size of a city. That's the kind of big scale stuff you're going to get here. Notice the little people over here on the lower left who are trying to walk away from this. These are people who are on their own because they escaped from the aliens who try to capture them when they land, and they get out into the whole territory. And most of that and the next novel, Shipstar, are about on the run in the bowl and what they learn. Next. Oh yeah, there's the fish thing, which is actually a balloon, and it's a life form, and its crew lives permanently aboard, and it's very big.
Crew is in fact symbiotes, part of the life cycle.
Say that again?
Its crew, the sunfishes, the starfishes,
right,
are symbiotes. They interact with the ship.
Right.
They can't be separated from it.
Right. You see, there's a lot of smart biotech in this whole complex. And now I'm going to jump right ahead saying what comes next. This is what's in this last novel, Glorious. This is the other construction that Larry and I put together. There is a thing we call the cobweb between two orbiting planets that are tide-bound to each other. The model for this is the planet Pluto, I still have to say it's a planet, and Charon, its large moon, which are both tide-locked. They always see the only one face of the other world. You see, the Earth-Moon system has a tide-locked moon, so we always see one face of the moon, but the Earth is not tide-locked. Pluto and Charon are tide-locked, and so this whole double planet construction is based on what we know about Pluto and Charon, which is now a lot since we've flown by. And that's the construction. With a large bulging point where there's exactly zero gravity between the two planets. That's where the spaceships dock. But you can see that this is an enormous construction. It's a big cylinder and all kinds of habitats that are linked to the planets. And so they get natural resources from both worlds. That's the key idea in the last novel. Let's see, next. Oh, and this is a piece of art by Brenda Guerre, whom we employed to depict something that's very mysterious in the atmosphere of the cobweb, and for most of the book, you don't even know what they are. And they are first a kind of a life form, but also are keeping track of things, and are a life form that we don't have an analogy for because they appear in this to be floating in the sky, but they're not just doing that. And all the way through the book, no one really knows what the hell they're up to, except they are actually, it involves a surveillance mechanism, a smart one, used by the people who actually run the cobweb. Next. Oh, this is, you can read this. It basically says, if you're going to live in a giant solar system sized contrivance, then you really got to be careful. Because there are all kinds of things that can go wrong and only a few things that can go right. So just read it and it'll make the case. I never like to read slides to people. I find it insulting. So that's kind of a walk around of the kind of idea work we did. Of course, all this is not about writing a novel, is it? It's about planning a novel. And Larry has a lot of work in this regard. How many Ringworld novels are there, Larry?
There were 4 that I wrote, and one that Ed Furman wrote.
You mean Ed Lerner?
The five stories set in known space.
Ah, yes.
Of the World series.
Right.
Of course, there's also the rest of known space, which is largely short stories.
Right. So, and there's also the integral trees, right? That's a whole new construction.
A whole different thing.
Yeah.
And it's actually better science fiction than original. It's done without faster than light travel or several other weird things that we allow ourselves to use to tell stories.
Right.
The smoke ring is a model built from Saturn and Titan with a planet whose atmosphere gets lost in, never mind. Read it yourself. The integral trees and the smoke ring.
Right.
And it's a different universe, not this one.
Which was Larry's next major constructed strange environment. Meanwhile, a lot of other writers, like say John Barley, had written a 3-novel sequence, like our 3-novel sequence, about a giant artifact in the solar system. And then Bob Shaw came in with a modified sort of Dyson Sphere, and then actually it's countless now. There are all kinds of writers who've written big object fiction.
Yes. You get a whole shelf of that, starting with it all.
Right. Yeah, it's become a subsection of the entire field. And you don't have to actually have a PhD in physics to write this kind of novel, though I think it helps.
Yeah. What it is a long-standing conversation that covers many centuries. I tell people that Dante's Inferno is part of the series of big constructions. Bowl of Heaven is just one iteration, and Ringworld just one
Exactly.
of the stories of how to build big and how to manage once you've done it.
Right, and Freeman Dyson himself told me that the idea for the Dyson Sphere came because he was reading all of Stapleton's Star Master and also Last and First Men, and there is a paragraph that alludes to something very much like a Dyson Sphere, large constructions around stars and so on, without spelling out any details. But the genius of Dyson is that he remembered this, and then he wrote an entire letter to which journal? Was it Nature? I think so. And they published it. This is a scientific paper that was published in 1960. I mean, he didn't write a novel about it. He wrote a scientific paper. It's hard to know which pays better. Dyson, alas, died in January at the age of 65. A brilliant guy. I met him when I was in grad school at UC San Diego in 1963. One of those moments you'll always remember, at least I remember. I can remember it was at a coffee break, and Dyson turned. He was dressed in a three-piece suit. You can imagine. La Jolla, 1963. This makes you stand out. But he turned and said, well, perhaps you'd like to, may I introduce you to Leo Szilard, who was also in a three-piece suit. And there was a big moment there. Of course, Leo Szilard is the guy who thought of the idea of nuclear weapons and how it could work in 1932. And so I thought, wow, man, this is just at a coffee break, right? And then Szilard turned and said, oh, yes, and this is Maria Geppert Mayer, who a year later won the Nobel Prize in nuclear physics, and was in the Manhattan Project. So it don't get no better than that, and it all happened in La Jolla when the campus had fewer than 1,000 people on it. So, end of advertisement. Next, what is the next slide? I forgot. Oh, this is my own personal note. I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico. A boat is just looking for a chance to sink. And that's true of all these constructions. So, okay, I think that's all the slideshow, isn't it?
It is, yes, that's the last slide.
Okay, good. Well, now we can do song and dance or Q&A, whichever you prefer.
So the first question we have, this is going to be from Earl. Let me exit out of the PowerPoint real quick.
Okay. And there are people out there in Facebook land.
Yes, there are people out here in Facebook land asking questions. And so Earl is asking, he has a two-part question. So first off, he says, I just loved your books. I have read many of them. My question to you is, in the bowl of heaven, what is the rotational speed to ensure that the gravity of the bowl is strong enough to keep things from falling off the bowl? Is the spin so great that it keeps the gravitational pull strong enough for everyone on the bowl? And what makes this spin occur?
We had about 0.8 gravity at the rim, didn't we?
Yes.
And the ring world had 1 gravity and spun at 770 miles per second in Earth's orbit. The bowl of heaven would have been spinning about a little more than half that fast. Call it 4,500 miles per second.
Right.
Hard to control.
Another way to look at it is at the rim of the bowl, you can dispatch something and it can leave the entire solar system. It's that fast.
Yeah.
And so you can launch things into interstellar space if you like. For example, to examine a planet or a solar system that's passing nearby, you've already got the velocity. You get to those speeds and get to a nearby star. A fact we don't really use very much, but it's by design. But it works to give you the centrifugal gravity. By the way, it's not gravitational effect, it's a centrifugal effect.
Awesome. And then the second part of the question by Earl is, my second question to both of you is in regards to writing the trilogy. Did you both write each chapter, or did you divide the chapters up so that each of you wrote different chapters? And did you each read the other's chapters to make suggestions and add or delete concepts or parts of the chapter?
We played with each other's work. I think Greg did most of the first drafting.
Yeah, that's true.
And I played and he played, and we came up with concepts that worked.
Right. Actually, what we did was have fun with it. So the right answer is all of the above. for these methods.
Every technique you've thought of, we probably used.
Right.
Nice. And when you guys originally started writing, how long did it take for you guys to do the first book, to kind of, from the idea of you guys, hey, let's do a book together, to then actually getting together and making it happen? What was that? Could you tell us a little bit more about that process?
A couple of years, wasn't it, Greg?
That's right. Yeah, which is a whole lot of nicely tax-deductible dinners and bottles of wine and other things necessary for the industry. Because we live about, 80 miles apart.
Nice. And, sorry, just checking really quick.
And of course, we all had a lot of collaborative experience. Larry famously had written a bunch of bestsellers with Jerry Pournelle and did all kinds of stuff. So we've worked with collaborators. And let me, here's a little editorial point. Science fiction is the only literature in which collaborations are common. You just don't see it in mysteries or mainstream novels or anything, really. And what's the reason? It's because science fiction is based on science, and the majority of all scientific papers are collaborations.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about it like that before.
Yeah. It's a clear picture of our origins.
Where do you feel like, especially since your books are so hard science, because science fiction can mean a lot nowadays, so where do you feel like you guys find the balance between incorporating the science and the fiction element?
We got a little weird near the end, but mostly we followed good physics.
Right.
Got a little weird with your stone mines.
Oh, yes, right.
I had a little trouble swallowing those.
All the way through these books, there are strange forms of life. One of them is actually a rock. Well, if you think about it, a computer is just a modified rock. It's a silicon chip.
Yes.
Where did most of the inspirations for the strange forms of life come from? Was it taken from like things in everyday life, or, for example, the photo we saw earlier of the balloon fish?
Well, we dreamed this up ourselves. Just daydreaming has been our habit for 80 years or so.
Right. We all thought of things and threw them in and tossed them around. That's really part of the fun of it. It's one of the reasons that collaborations are so common in science fiction, is that science is fun too that way. I've written over 100 scientific papers with co-authors, actually over 200. But that's part of the fun of it, you see, which you don't get in detective novels or mainstream novels. And that's what nobody remarks on, but is clearly an advantage of the genre, I think. Or if you want to go back to the genre classification, in terms of science fiction, we're the gunslingers. Everybody else is a pilgrim. I'm using the John Wayne thing here.
Well, looks like we have another question that came in from Carrie. And it says, "Hi, Gregory and Larry. It's wonderful to have you with us tonight. Thank you. Many of us fall in love with science and science fiction when we are younger. Do either of you have any specific classic or modern books, fiction or nonfiction, you would recommend to new genre readers? We are always looking to share inspiration to people of all ages."
You better try that, Greg.
Well, the obvious thing to point to is Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, both because it's short and it's still valid, and it sold over 3 million copies. I was the checker for that, for Bantam Books, by the way, because we were both being published by the same editor. But there are so many things. If you really want to know about science generally, you could start with a great book like Guns, Germs, and Steel, if you want to talk about how environment influenced civilization. I mean, that's a great popularization. But in terms of physics, there are numerous books by Paul Davies, who always writes very well about physics and its implication, although his most recent book, I've forgotten the title, is about the mystery of cancer, because he was the head of an NSF working group to try to figure out why we don't have a theory of cancer. And he makes a bunch of good suggestions in there. You see, the NSF really wanted to have a fresh attack on the fact that we haven't made much progress on cancer. As Paul pointed out to me, he's a British physicist. The actual lessening of the mean survival from cancer, average overall cancers, in the last half century has been 4 months. 4 months, if you average over everything. The war on cancer has been lost so far. So, of course, if you want new ideas, original from outside the field that are incisive and so forth, you always hire a physicist.
Put in plugs for Robert Forward and Hal Clement.
Oh, yeah.
Who wrote very, very specifically science-oriented stories. Hal Clement, in particular, several, many short stories, and some interesting novels. Mission of Gravity is canonical.
Right. And you know, if you want advanced ideas, you could read the more recent books by Freeman Dyson. He has a whole book of essays about strange ideas that is really illustrative, that I've used or copied or stole.
And
Pardon?
along the lines of writing, what do you guys find to be kind of the biggest difference between writing a scientific paper versus, while this is still hard science, it is fiction? What do you think is kind of like the easiest part and then the hardest part of the difference between the two?
Wow. Larry?
Gregory reads far more scientific papers than I do, but I kept up when it counted. When it counted was during the New Wave period about 40 to 30 years ago, when everybody was trying to write as if characterization was the most important thing, and stylistic innovations.
Yes. You came in and wiped out so many assumptions, and everybody flocked to you, like me. Yeah. You returned the field to its origins of ideas, nifty twists, all that stuff. When nobody else was doing it, it was not fashionable.
Yeah.
And I remember when we met, I think in '65, and I said, boy, all these great ideas. I was just working on my doctorate. Little did I know.
At this time, science fiction is a lot harder to write because you've got to follow all of the rules. And some of the rules were what I was doing. Some of the rules are count on good writing.
Yeah.
A critic's version of good writing.
Exactly. And although the virtue of fiction is that you don't have to have footnotes or references, at the end of every one of our books together, we have had footnotes and references in an afterword and even links. So, because a lot of readers like to follow up on the ideas and know where to go.
Yeah. And this is kind of a follow-up question we had another reader ask. His name is Kevin. He says, gentlemen, big, longtime fan of both of you gunslingers. Can't wait to read through the final novel here. His question is, what areas of the genre of science fiction still entertain or interest you nowadays? And then also kind of asking more on if there's any specific periodicals that pique your interest. So kind of just elaborating on the recommendation question. And also what part of science fiction now interests you?
I subscribe to every science fiction magazine that's published in hard form, which is about 7 or 8. Even Interzone, the English one, I have a lifetime sub. But what about you, Larry?
I've been reading stuff on my Kindle, and I've been picking the cheap ones. I suppose it says something about my personality, but you can get some really good old science fiction in the $2.99 regime.
Huh.
And
I prefer hardcovers.
I'm reading Fool's Company stories. Marilyn, my wife, discovered them and passed a few on to me.
Which ones are those?
Fool's Company is a military, a set of military stories by Phil Folio.
Oh.
Not by no, the other guy. Sorry, I lost it in my head.
Yeah, I get at least several hundred SF hardcovers a year. Some I only read a chapter of. But I give it a try, and then I donate it to what I've got left or don't want to keep to the Eden collection at UC Riverside, which is grateful for them because I'd like to continually expand the collection. It's over 100,000 volumes already.
Dang, but that's a good, true, loving book spirit. Oh, I love that.
Yeah. I get all the magazines. I read most of the notable hardcovers, and even crummy old paperbacks and everything. Really. I look at everything. Of course, I'm hard to satisfy.
I'd get a lot more reading done, if profitable reading, if I had more of the ability to stop reading when I don't like a book.
Well, I recommend throwing the book across the wall until it hits and the spine cracks, so you can't return it to anybody, and then you throw it in the trash. But no, I actually give it to you.
I've never done that.
But it does remind you that you read this book before, or tried to before.
You can tell then. So if anyone is ever walking in someone's house and sees a bunch of books with the spines cracked, you know those aren't the ones you want to ask to borrow.
I tend to take them out and put them in the garage. I'm not complete messy.
We used to have to warn the readers that a book with its cover torn off is cheating the author. The book
That's right.
The cover was returned for a refund.
Yeah. No, yeah, you should never have a book with the cover off. Someone has done a big no-no if you got one of those.
Unless you just rip it off yourself because you're so angry with it.
And then we have, this is one last question, and I think this is a perfect question to end it on. This is from Earl, and let's see. Thanks to both of you for putting on this event. It's really awesome to have the ability to hear and see both of you and to be able to ask questions. To Larry, my favorite book of yours was written with Jerry P. was Football, but I feel that your work with Greg and this new trilogy has surpassed my expectations, and it now is at the top of my list. Can't wait to read the last part, Glorious. Do either of you foresee another book in the future by the two of you together? And then I'm also going to add on to that, what other projects are you working on that you can discuss?
Oh.
We don't have time at this point. We did enjoy working together. If we come up with something, we'll occasionally sit down and start spinning ideas at each other. That's how the Glorian series came about.
Right, which took a decade, you recall.
Yeah. And it'll take more if the coronavirus doesn't go away.
True. Our agent, Eleanor Wood, is pursuing the idea of a collection of stories by other people that we would edit that's set in the whole bowl of heaven context. I don't know. But after all, Larry had quite a few volumes of known space stories, including all the Man Kazin Wars books, one of which I wrote.
There are 15 volumes of the Man Kazin Wars stories.
Wow, really?
Yeah.
See?
And a couple of novels, full novels.
Right.
And outside of your collaborations together, do you have any other projects that you're working on that readers can be expecting?
Well, I've published a novel, I published, let's see, in the last 3 years, I published 3 novels, or I'm about to. The Berlin Project is an alternative history of the Second World War involving characters whom I knew. I knew almost everybody who's in the novel who worked on the Manhattan Project, because I'm really old. And then published, Rewrite, that was published last year, which is a different version of a guy who wakes up after he's died and he's back in his 16-year-old body, and it's 1968, and so he has a lot of fun in California in that era, because I was here in 1968. And the novel I'm about to finish, Shadows of Eternity, is about a woman who works in the SETI library over 2 centuries from now, when there are a lot of SETI messages, and what that implies. So that's almost done. It'll be out in about a year or so.
Awesome.
I've got a few collaborations going. One, I'm working on a Gil the Arm story with Stephen Barnes.
Yeah, I look forward to that.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, you know, SF mysteries and cop stories are almost a subgenre.
And Matthew Joseph Harrington is working with me on a novel. It started with an idea I was given nearly 60 years ago by my stepsister, who got it from a writer who had given up on it.
Huh.
But we'll see how that works out. It involves a freeway ramp that only exists between midnight and dawn. Right.
You know, in a genre that's heavy on ideas, collaboration really works because you can brainstorm ideas with people. And mainstream novelists and so forth, they don't have the ability to do that. There's no culture that makes it happen.
You get your practice in grade school talking about the books you've read.
Yeah, right. That's what's unique about the genre. And as one does notice, when you're old as we are, that the genre has taken over the mass media. But when we were growing up, it was the tiny minority that was frowned upon by virtually everyone.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is it. Let me double check our questions one more time. That is it for the questions that we've got. So I'm going to go ahead. We are at our time for today, so I'm going to go ahead and close out the Facebook. Thank you everyone so much for attending and for all of your great questions. And also, if you would like to purchase a copy of Gregory and Larry's book, the link is going to be right up by the event link. And they are going to be signing and personalizing book plates for you guys, so you can place those orders until a week from today. Thank you so much, everyone, for tonight. Have a good night, guys.
Thank you. Good night.